Hello, and welcome to the Race, Wealth, and Health Podcast, a podcast that serves to educate and empower while we explore the intersections of social justice, economic empowerment, and holistic well-being within communities of color. I am your host, Dr. Joycelyn Morris, and I invite you to join me as we dive deep into the crucial topics that shape our lives, challenge the status quo, and strive for a more equitable future for all. This week's episode, we have Adam Susaneck coming to speak with us about segregation by design. We will discuss everything you want to know about architecture's role in racial inequality. Thank you for joining us, and let's get into this discussion. I am Dr. Joycelyn Morris, and I'm excited to have Adam Susaneck here on Race, Wealth, and Health Podcast. Welcome, Adam.
Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. How are you doing this morning?
Pretty good. How about you?
Can't complain. Excited for this interview and can't wait to get into this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Adam and I met very randomly at a dog bar, both being dog lovers. And I want to say, I think that in probably some of our small talk, we connected over, maybe I was talking about my dissertation. I was finishing my dissertation at that time. And I think I mentioned something around my work and my desire and interest around wealth, right? Race and wealth and the racial wealth gap. And I think that's when you start talking to me, or maybe you told me first. I can't remember. I don't know which one came first, the chicken or the egg, but I know that we got rather deep into conversation around race and politics and just a lot of things that were happening, but specifically with you and the work that you do with segregation by design. So would you mind, for my listeners who are not familiar with segregation by design, giving a brief overview of that?
Yeah, absolutely. And you might want to explain what a dog bar is too, because it can be kind of, if you just say it, people are like, what was that?
What's a dog bar? Yeah. No.
Yeah. So I started the project Segregation by Design. What I'm doing with the project is trying to use remastered historical photography in addition to demographic data and historical census data to reveal the extent to which basically each and every American city was sort of physically and architecturally hollowed out based on race. So I'm talking in particular about the effects of redlining, the municipal ongoing effects of the policy of redlining, in addition to the effect of the interstate highway system, how that was planned and actualized, and the policies of urban renewal, in addition to the disinvestment caused by those policies over the years. So what I'm trying to do with the project is show that the American city has been made systematically more dangerous and worse for people of color and through these urban renewal projects and highway projects, and that this was a very intentional process. We have all the documents saying they routed 95 through Overtown, Miami, for instance, in order to enact what they called slum clearance. And they were very, very explicit about why they considered Overtown a slum, because of the population that lived there, not necessarily because of the physical condition of the neighborhood itself, not being particularly old, but not to get too into the weeds about Miami. But in short, I use historical photography to show in a simple and digestible way how neighborhoods of color were destroyed in American cities.
Yeah. And so I know your background is in architecture, but how did you get into this project? Was it like a part of work? Was it just something you were playing around with one day? Like, how did you get into wanting to show visually the effects of policies on these neighborhoods, mostly historical neighborhoods of color?
Well, a couple different reasons. I mean, I like to say that I read the book, The Color of Law, which I recommend everyone read, which really goes into this subject quite succinctly and comprehensively. I read that book and was frustrated that there weren't more pictures. And as an architect, or trained as an architect, I'm a very visual person, but I think we all are these days, especially with Instagram and various other outlets. But another reason is there's an excellent book out there called The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. And the subtitle of the book is What Racism Costs All of Us and How We Can Prosper Together. She's trying to explain how systemic racism, legalized racism, political racism has really cost not just the targets of it, but every American in general. The central metaphor of her book is the public swimming pool. So public swimming pools in the United States used to be very common in American cities before the 1950s. And this is when public meant like New York Public Library, like big, beautiful public facilities. And they were whites only. So they were whites only swimming pools when they were built in the 30s mostly. And then in the 1950s, when desegregation orders come down from the court, many cities, rather than integrate their pools, drain them and demolish them. And they're explicit about why they do that. It's in order to avoid integration. And Montgomery, Alabama is very explicit about it, St. Louis, Buffalo. And then after that, you see the rise of backyard swimming pools in the suburbs that were mostly at the time, and still are, for all intents and purposes, whites only, due to restrictive covenants, exclusionary zoning. But what's interesting about that point is that in the name of racism, in the name of avoiding integration, the government privatized a public good and made it for only those who could afford it.
Yeah.
So that's basically what we did with a lot of public architecture, a lot of public transit, public housing, is that in the name of upholding segregation, we destroyed these public goods. And so I was interested in why the nature of the public realm is so eroded in the United States versus other countries. And I found that idea of the drained pool, of the racial zero-sum politics, really informed so much of that, including our built environment. And that's why I'm interested in the built environment. I found that when you really dig into it, that idea of this zero-sum has come to define the nature of the public realm of the United States. And again, that extends to the built environment. And that's why I'm so interested in it, because it affects how we build. The nature of what we learn in architecture school is informed by all of this history. I joke because I'd say that I was trying to figure out where all the trolleys went in the United States, because they're still pretty common in Europe and elsewhere. And there's a lot of reasons we got rid of them, but Rosa Parks may have integrated the bus, so we turned around and destroyed the bus. We made the bus fucking terrible, and that's like what we did with the pool there. But it's a rabbit hole. It's like we destroyed the public realm. So that's two reasons. Color Law wanted more pictures.
Yeah.
Wanted to figure out what the hell happened to our public space, like this building in the background that is Penn Station.
I am curious as to how did you come to an understanding of race being centralized in this conversation? Because I'm assuming you didn't necessarily go into it thinking of the racialized impacts of the decisions of the architecture of the demolishing of certain public resources and spaces.
Because it's always present. It's another reason I was going to say I started this is because I trained as an architect, and the nature of the field and the nature of the industry. What am I going to do? Build houses for rich people? That's basically what you do in architecture. If you work in most firms, is you're building houses for rich people or wealthy. If you're in New York, you're always building some tower in Brooklyn, and you're just asked to ignore the fact that you're displacing people and building normally far fewer units that aren't even designed to really live in. They're just designed as commodities, like investment properties. So no one lives there. There's a good article in the New York Times, Taller Towers, Fewer Homes. That's a great headline too. It's like they're building these towers in New York, but they're not building the right thing. They're building empty shells for investment. So I got these skills, and it's like, oh crap, what the hell are they good for? Architecture is not as everyday as I thought, because the design of everyday spaces that most people use has been corporatized. So I guess it's, what could I do so I could use these skills to talk about it?
I was actually going to say, we're talking about the intersectionality of race, wealth, and health. And from a wealth perspective, you were just saying that you don't build things for normal people, right? And certainly we can unpack what your definition is of normal. That might be helpful, but I think it may lean into my question around how does wealth show up in your work in terms of who has it, right? Who doesn't? And I imagine that is driving what you see in the taller towers and fewer homes. If you could expound on that and talk about that intersectionality in terms of what you see from a wealth and power dynamics, how much of it is racial versus wealth versus power, or are they all intertwined? Let's just be honest, because we want to have honest conversation. Who has the wealth and who's driving a lot of these decisions as it relates to architecture that is clearly affecting certain communities?
Absolutely. It's all intertwined. So there's a couple different answers to that question. Well, first part to the question, who's normal? I don't know. I guess it's easier to define who the architecture is for rather than who it's not. And it's for oligarchs and rich folks at this point.
Got it.
Normal, I guess I was thinking middle class. It does all come down to wealth, but middle class is not really extant anymore as we knew it, and it was never extant for Black people in particular, because the nature of middle class now means you're always one catastrophe away from just being broke or being like fucked. And it's always been, normal people.
When you defined who architecture is typically geared towards, the rich and extremely wealthy, then the idea is that everyone else is unimportant, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it goes to this idea of the public. We never necessarily had a real integrated public realm, but we've gotten worse. I love the Heather McGhee example so much because rather than integrate the public, we've dismantled it.
What do you mean when you say the public?
But here in West Palm, our main public space is a city place. That's private. It's like owned by a private company. And there's the plaza, Flagler Park.
Yeah.
And that's why there's so many homeless people there, because that is one of the only public parks. And it's like public has come to mean the least common denominator. It's the idea of public being something that's good inherently has been sort of dismantled and become something that meant for the poor rather than just for the public.
If I could expound, I understand what you're saying. Going back to your example around the pools today, public pools versus private pools tends to mean a certain thing. Or we don't have a great public transportation here, but taking the Tri-Rail is a very different experience than taking the Bright Line, which is clearly a privatized form of transportation, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. It's like the word public has become a dog whistle, which is crazy. Like public transit for white people means a bus. And ask anyone about Tri-Rail and it's like racism just comes right up. That's what I mean. Public has become devalued.
Yeah, public spaces, fair enough.
It's this idealized, integrated public space that never really existed, but we got kind of close in like the 90s, kind of.
Yeah, it's interesting. Maybe if you want to give an example of how you see wealth show up in the work that you do.
Well, wealth has always been tied to race in this country.
That's true.
Especially in South. I'm talking two particular examples. Miami and Chicago have oddly similar stories. When Jim Crow was law, when the color of your skin affected your ability to vote, one way to get political power, if you were a Black person back then, was to own property. And the easiest place to own property was the Black neighborhood because it was very cheap to buy. So Bronzeville in Chicago and Overtown in Miami, which due to official segregation, legal segregation, were the only central locations that Black people were allowed to live. It's a circular economy, and it was fairly successful. So places like Bronzeville developed their own banks, developed their own system of lending, because redlining made that difficult.
Yep.
And it was Black run, but it was fundamentally exploitative because the only reason those things were allowed to exist and could be profitable was because Black people had no other choice.
Right.
So somebody actually becomes a slumlord, because there's basically no other way to run these operations, because redlining and various iterations of Jim Crow housing policy make it very difficult to build anything new. So you just have to keep subdividing these apartments into worse and worse, into smaller and smaller apartments. And it makes these particular people tremendously rich. And they gain political power because they have property. But it's ultimately futile for them. This is the 30s and 40s I'm talking about. Then when the highways come through, they get bought out. The book, A World More Concrete, he talks about this a lot, how eminent domain really revealed that property ownership is not equal, not made equal. because the Black people whose property was taken during eminent domain, again, they get screwed over. They get a lot less than the property is worth. They're still wealthy, but they lose a lot of wealth. And then for the people who they're renting, they just get fucked. Again, Nathan Connolly in this book, A World War Concrete, makes this point that eminent domain shows that property ownership is not made equal. In America, the idea of property ownership is like sacrosanct. It used to be a requirement for voting, but the idea is that it gets you a seat at the table. And it did for them to some extent. The table was rigged, as it were, because again, they were just taking part in a system that had been set up to exploit them. So wealth is important, but in this country, it's just tied up in race.
Yeah.
So again, these wealthy Black neighborhoods get destroyed.
Yeah. Yeah. I wanted to pause for our listeners because I want to make sure that we take time to break down some of the concepts. So you mentioned redlining, right? And so a lot of folks are familiar with redlining. Some may or may not be, but typically it was the practice of banks when lending would have a map and essentially draw red lines, and whatever fell within and or outside of that, they would refuse to lend to someone who lived in particular areas. And those were typically, as you alluded to, Black neighborhoods, especially at that time, typically Black neighborhoods that were redlined were not able to receive funding and loans to either renovate or to even just purchase property. So I just want to make sure that we touched on that. And then the other thing you mentioned was eminent domain. Do you want to kind of give a brief overview on eminent domain? I imagine it's happening now in Miami as well, as they've been expanding and developing.
Urban renewal and gentrification are different. They're related, but I'm specifically talking about urban renewal as defined by the 1949 Federal Housing Act, which provided a 2/3 federal match for urban renewal and slum clearance projects. So when white flight happens in the 50s and 60s, as spurred on by the construction of highways and the deterioration caused by redlining, but white flight happens from city centers as encouraged by the government. And city centers across the country, every single one, their tax bases dry up. They have a lot of vacancies because people are moving out, and municipal services get cut back because of loss of taxes. Sidewalks crumble because in a lot of cities, homeowners or property owners are required to maintain sidewalks. So what urban renewal is trying to do is to reverse that decay within what we now become known as the inner city. And because white people move to the suburbs, this area, that just formerly was the city, becomes known as like the inner city. And that becomes like a dog whistle racialized term because, again, it's white people who leave these neighborhoods, Black people, Hispanic people who are sort of forced to stay behind because they can't move to the new suburbs because of restricted covenants. But what urban renewal is trying to do is use federal money from this federal urban renewal bill to repair their downtowns, but remake them for the convenience of the people who left, because they're still driving in for their jobs. So what they're trying to do is save the historic city center by making it really accessible and easy, and for people in the suburbs to come to work, spend their money, not necessarily live there. They don't build a lot of housing. What you see is they build giant convention centers, urban renewal projects. Convention center is a classic one. Big old stadia, big government in West Palm. They clear out Banyan Street and make it the courthouse and the police station. A lot of parking for suburban folks. So, and that's why so many city centers are similar. They have similar architecture. It's because this was all funded by the same bill at the same time, the 1949 Housing Act. And that's in effect for a couple decades. It doesn't exist anymore. And it clears out a lot of neighborhoods that they consider obsolete, replaces them, as I said, with like amenities focused on suburban commuters. And that's why in that same vein, we lose a lot of downtown public transit systems, like streetcar systems. Those disappear for various reasons. But one of the main reasons is the devaluation of the center city. And, where we do build new transit, it's very focused on the suburbs, like MARTA in Atlanta is very extensive, like it goes really far, versus the old streetcar system, which covered the downtown and center city very tightly. Same in Barton, Oakland, like it goes from a system that's really designed to serve Oakland. BART then becomes a suburban shuttle that passes through Oakland to San Francisco.
Yeah.
So that's what urban renewal is.
Okay. I mean, we know homeownership is definitely a pathway to wealth, but specifically, you were saying certainly back during the Jim Crow days, homeownership was also a political power tool, if you will, for individuals across the board, but certainly for even some individuals of color. And when they were affected by eminent domain,
Mm.
and that's what I wanted to break down, then a
Oh, yeah.
lot lost their homes. For the listeners, eminent domain is a right of the government to essentially expropriate private property for their public use with compensation. But you alluded to the fact that oftentimes it's not market value.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So when you get your house taken by eminent domain, you're supposed to receive just compensation. The government determines what that is.
Right.
And Overtown, because it's all black owned, is redlined. And so redlining is a process, as you mentioned, where banks draw up maps grading each neighborhood for investment, and specifically in the terms of whether or not they're going to give out mortgages. They're grading it for like liquidity or for like credit worthiness. I think that's it. Like,
Yeah, like how risky the investment would be if
right,
it's a
right.
good neighborhood, good return on their investment by lending.
And
Yeah.
most actual redlining maps have been destroyed. A, because a lot of them are private documents made by banks, but B, they had to destroy a lot of them in the 60s. This was the Depression that redlining happened. So the banks, because lending is so risky right now, they will only do so with FDIC insurance, and the FDIC will only they work with the HOLC to make these maps that basically just become federal redlining maps.
Yeah.
So they were distributed to these banks, and they said, if you don't do this, we're not going to insure you. So yeah, what redlining says is that we won't insure you if you lend to these people. So they didn't. So the property values collapse. It makes the environment more favorable for these people who really become slumlords that I'm talking about. And this is what capitalism does. It's profiteer. So the existing property owner gets fucked because their property value goes down significantly. But for people who own like rental housing, it's pretty good for them because it makes it so that no one can really buy anymore. And it's really abysmal.
Actually, where I wanted to sort of pivot for our listeners, you recently, or not that long ago, based on when this interview comes out, attended South by Southwest. And so you did a talk there. And if I'm not mistaken, that was in reference to an article that you recently did. If you want to tell the listeners about it and what you're currently working on, because I think there's some things that we wanted to share around how people of color are positioned in the work that you're currently doing.
Yeah, yeah. So I had the opportunity to write an article for the New York Times, and it's basically an overview thesis of the project. So it was a great opportunity. There's some cool graphics. And then, yeah, I spoke at South by, had the opportunity actually to meet Heather McGee, who wrote the book I mentioned, The Sum of Us, and a couple other incredible people, but some excellent filmmakers and authors too. And then I'm working on another article actually about how the rate of pedestrian death is twice as high in communities of color and non-white neighborhoods in particular, and how for a Black person, when corrected for distance traveled, they're more likely, 2.4 times more likely to be struck and killed by a vehicle than a white person, with similar numbers for Hispanic people and much higher numbers for Native Americans.
Wow.
Right? Like, yeah. But one of the main reasons for that is because of redlining. Not all neighborhoods are created equal. So most of these pedestrian deaths, it's not just who's getting killed, it's where they're getting killed. Most
Fair.
of them happen in neighborhoods that are poor, that have fewer white people. And that's the direct result of things like redlining. So what I mentioned earlier, 67% of pedestrian deaths where someone's struck and killed by a car happen when there's no sidewalk. 2/3. So A, that's not surprising, not that complicated. There's no sidewalk, you got to walk on the street, might get hit by a car. And as I was saying, one of the results of redlining is that property values drop, neighborhoods get transformed into targets for slum clearance and urban renewal. That, again, many of these projects are automobile focused. It's also where highways get built, where high-speed infrastructure gets built. So in addition to the highways that invariably goes through these neighborhoods, redlining drops the property values, in addition to having all these fumes now from the highway, and vacancies increase. And again, in America, in a lot of cities, property owners are required to maintain their own sidewalks. So when these vacancies happen, these sidewalks are left to crumble in front of empty buildings, you know.
Yeah.
And so like walking down the street to the bus stop, it becomes a matter of life and death. It's like 8th Street in Riviera Beach.
Here in Florida.
Yeah, now they called it MLK, which they always do. 8th Street connected 95 to the port, and it went right through, you know, a residential neighborhood in Riviera. And they demolished the houses on either side and made it into basically a highway. And where there were intersections at every block, now there's like 4 pedestrian crossings. So people are gonna run across the street. You know, it's not rocket science.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I mean, I think that the rates and the differences of the rates are definitely alarming. So what are we seeing? Are we seeing a particular uptick and increase in these pedestrian deaths recently? And what sort of time frame or timeline have we seen this increase of pedestrian deaths?
So pedestrian deaths are at a 40-year high. Yeah, they're up like 14% over 2019. So there's a bunch of reasons why they're up. The worse infrastructure gets, the worse these sidewalks deteriorate, the more people are going to die. Like, I really can't harp on the importance of freaking sidewalks and crosswalks enough. Like, it's not that complicated. But so that's one reason. So deaths in like Buffalo pedestrian deaths were like way up during the pandemic in Buffalo.
Mhm.
And it was during that period, like those 2 summers where everyone was like socially distancing and going outside all the time.
Yeah.
And deaths were up on the west side, the black side of Buffalo. Most of the pedestrian deaths were concentrated on the black side. And that's because there's like no parks. And again, the sidewalks, as I mentioned, have collapsed and they don't maintain the infrastructure. You know, the west side used to have this big linear park designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, who designed Central Park and Prospect Park, and he was like one of the most famous landscape architects. And the west side had a park that went right through the middle that was the heart of this neighborhood, and it was like a middle-class neighborhood with Black professionals. Like, there's a lot of history there. But they built a highway over this linear park, so it's gone now. They pave over the part on the black side, and the parkways are still there on the white side. And you see these pictures of all these people out there using the parkways just as they were intended. And on the west side, they got nothing, you know.
I was going to say, for your example of Buffalo and specifically talking about the pandemic and how that increased, and a lot of folks were just outside and obviously out in the street because there were no parks. And that goes back to the earlier part of that conversation, talking about public spaces, right? Like building architecture, creating architecture for public spaces so that all people can have green spaces that they can enjoy. And I think we all saw the importance of that during the pandemic. I mean, certainly we here in South Florida got quite a bit of people migrating down here for more open land and space and backyard and that sort of thing, right? But in some of the urban city areas, that wouldn't be as important if there were more green spaces, right? Like more public spaces, more parks.
Yeah, and then just another, I mean, that's a why pedestrian deaths. There's a lot of reasons, you know, but one of them is driving. You need a focus. You just can't anymore. And then in America, I would be remiss if I didn't say that vehicle prices have just gotten so large. A bigger truck is more likely to kill you, and trucks have gotten freaking huge. So there's that. Speed limits have gotten higher. You know, the national speed limit of 65 miles an hour, but speed limits have gotten higher, and the faster you drive, the more likely you are to kill someone. That's like actually one of the most important factors. Yeah, and then the speed limits on the highway affect people's behavior off because everyone treats
the streets like the highways.
like a highway, right?
Yeah.
Fair enough. Because a lot of reasons that deaths are up, but the reason for this disparity is everything that we're talking about, the sort of disinvestment in those particular neighborhoods.
Yep. No, it definitely makes sense. As we talked about a lot in this passion project of segregation by design, there's a lot that you're covering. But in terms of what you do with segregation by design, what are you hoping that people will will get? When people are engaging with your content, what is it that you're hoping they will walk away either understanding or feeling?
Yeah. Well, I guess I want people to recognize that the built environment is changeable. Recognize that the effect that it has is monumental. We treat the highways like mountains, like they've always been there. But not only have they not always been there, they were only made like 60 years ago, and they were made by fucking assholes. They weren't made to transport people necessarily. They were made to sell cars. If they were actually interested in moving people, they would have built the metro for if they're interested in spending money and getting people to buy cars and keeping Black people in that place. But I want people to recognize the all-encompassing effects of the built environment in terms of the air we breathe, pollution from these cars, and just the importance of that. Because when you go to a place that does have a better built environment and you see and feel the effect of a better built environment, it's really impressive, the difference it can make. And when you think about it, it's obvious. And to recognize that these fields that present themselves as objective traffic engineering are absolutely not, and they're based on assumptions that are of technologies from the 1960s. They've been tested and they're wrong. There's not enough capacity on a highway to handle the sprawl that it brings. There never has been. It's never worked. And the solution was always build more. And they thought that eventually they could build enough, but we can't. It's just a geometry problem. So yeah, recognize that these things are changeable. They were ill-advised in the first place. It may seem natural, but there's absolutely nothing natural about a highway. If you explain our transportation system to someone in the 20s, they'd be like, what? In order to get across town, you have to take 4 tons of metal with you and 2 benches? Like, okay.
Fair enough. One thing you mentioned, some of this is about wealth creation, let's just be honest, right? About moving certain things in and accommodating particular populations. But, you know, as a white male, why should others and other white people care about these issues? Like, why should they care about the effects on others?
Because as I said, it affects them. Why don't we have good public transportation? Why don't we have good public schools? But again, not to keep going back to Heather McGhee, but this racial zero sum affects us all. More people are getting killed. I mean, it's affecting Black people in particular, and especially Native Americans. But the racial zero sum is putting the whole country at risk because it's destroyed, again, the idea of the public, of the idea that we can live together, because we don't live together anymore.
But did we ever really live together?
More so. I mean, I am romanticizing an idealized past, but urban living, even when segregated, is always less segregated than suburban living. And,
Fair.
in Florida now we have these suburban ghettos. And that's because we didn't build any public housing in downtown. So that everyone who got displaced just had to leave. And our cities all used to be a little bit more like New York. And I know that's difficult for people to imagine, but that's why I try to show these photos. Like, yeah, it was segregated, and yes, the streetcars were segregated. They had to sit in the back, but everyone was on the same streetcar. At least they weren't 15 miles away,
Right.
or 30 miles away, And in like Miami and a lot of southern cities where they never built public housing, one of the reasons that a lot of the population supported destroying Overtown, actually, A, was because the property owners knew they could get some money out of it. But then B, they were sold this idea that there would be better life in the suburbs. We have suburban ghettos, for lack of a better word. There's a book I have here called Making the Second Ghetto that's all about this process. Like, we destroyed the first ghetto, which is Overtown.
In the South, people moved to suburbs to become ghettoized, and then in the North, they moved into town. And the Howard settled ghetto.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's your overall goal and hope, is to bring awareness to the issues and have people understand how infrastructure and highways specifically have been used to segregate our communities, right? And so segregation by design, right? Like,
Yeah.
that infrastructure is built people are displaced, moved with promises of things being better, but truly it's to keep certain populations in and keep other populations out from having access.
Exactly.
Yep.
And what we destroyed was segregated. Again, Overtown was segregated. Bronzeville was. But it was a physical built environment that could have handled immigration. And that's one of the reasons they destroyed it. Because suburbs and suburbanization force segregation. It doesn't have to be racial, but it is individual. You are separate now. And you then, and your transportation is separate. And you choose everywhere. There's no room for chance encounters. There's no room for anything. And that affects your psychology. And in the United States, it is racially segregated.
Yeah. But just quick close out, any tips? I know you gave us a couple of books. There's A Color of Law, The Sum of Us, Making the Second Ghetto. Any quote or anything you want to leave our listeners with?
Yeah, also check out A World War Country. It's about Miami, but Miami is really indicative of our son.
Okay, perfect. And then social links. How can our people find you? I know on Instagram you are Segregation by Design. Where else can our listeners connect with you?
Yeah. On Instagram, check out my website. On Twitter.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Adam, for taking the time to chat with me today. And I look forward to reading that article that you have coming out soon. Well, that's all for today, folks. Enjoyed the show? Be sure to like and rate the podcast. You can find the Race, Wealth, and Health podcast on multiple platforms, including Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Be sure to subscribe and turn on your notifications so you never miss an episode. I also want to hear from you, so don't forget to connect with me on social media. You can follow the podcast on Instagram and Facebook at Race, Wealth, Health. By joining the online community, you'll stay updated on the latest episodes, behind-the-scenes insights, and engaging discussions. Share your thoughts, comments, and questions there. I appreciate your support in sharing the podcast with your friends, family, and colleagues who may also find value in these conversations. Thank you again for joining me on this journey. Until next time, take care, stay informed, and keep up the good fight for equality.